Hello, welcome to Community Groups. We're so glad that you got together with your community group this evening and that you are learning with one another, you're encouraging one another, and that you're praying with one another. As you know, in community groups, we have been focusing on the one another commands of the New Testament. And last week, Pastor Brian began by helping us look at the hazardous paths to avoid. Many of the one another commands are stated in a positive way, as in do this or do that. Several of the one another commands are stated in a negative way, as in don't do this and don't do that. So those are the commands that Pastor Brian and I have been asked to speak upon. And so we're going to continue looking at some hazardous paths to avoid. As we begin, I want to show you a picture that introduces the first one another command that we're going to focus on. This picture was posted on Pastor Steve Veyer's social media page. Many of you remember him as he was out here with a team from Faith of Lafayette for our Biblical Counseling Conference back in March of this year. And many of you were served by him and encouraged by his ministry as he came out here. But as you'll notice, this picture he posted on his social media, it has some pretty negative things to say about Pastor Veyers. It says, Pastor Veyers, keep your hands off our kids. Ordinance 3121 would help end the practice of conversion therapy on minors in West Lafayette. Pastor Steve Veyers and his cronies on the city council want to block Ordinance 3121 and continue the practice of child abuse in our community. Again, this was posted by Pastor Veyers on his social media page, and it was a picture of a flyer that was passed around at Purdue University there in West Lafayette. And many people read this flyer and were passing it around and looking at it. And the sad thing is that it demonstrates what we're going to look at tonight. None of this is true. This is called slander. Many of you know, when Pastor Veyers was here, that he is no child abuser at all. He is someone who loves young people and serves them, and he has a ministry that has served at-risk youth. He also talked about when he was here how he and his wife adopted a special needs boy, and he is now their son. He struggles with all kinds of physical issues like blindness and so forth. And so, this is totally false. These accusations are totally wrong. But the reason why I brought this up is because it illustrates what James says in James 4, verse 11, when he says, "Speak not evil one of another." And that is the first one another command that we're going to focus on tonight. Number one, we're going to look at don't defame one another. And that's found here in James chapter 4, verse 11. Don't defame one another. What does defame mean? Here in this verse, the Greek word for defame is a compound word. That means it's kind of two words squished into one. And literally it means to speak against. Those of you who have a different translation, it may say it that way. And in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12, it's translated as that. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12, the persecutors of the church were speaking evil things about the church members. It also could mean to slander someone. It's translated as that in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 16. It means to spread an evil report about someone or to injure another's reputation. The word reputation is very similar to the word fame, and we see that in the word defame, to ruin someone's reputation. We also see it in our legal realm when we hear people talk about defamation of character. That's what defame means. It means to ruin someone's character or someone's reputation. Many of you are familiar with the famous legal case that was in the news quite a bit earlier this year between Amber Heard and Johnny Depp. And Johnny Depp brought a case against his ex-wife Amber Heard because she had defamed his character. He brought a defamation of character case. She had accused him of spousal abuse and had ruined his reputation and which had impacted his career and made it very difficult for him to make money in his career. Those are examples of what defame means. And James tells us that this is a hazardous path to avoid. We should not speak evil one of another. One of the reasons why we should not do this is because it's something that Satan does. Satan loves to defame others. In Genesis chapter 3, we read the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And you're familiar with that story. I love how the ESV states it. The serpent comes to Eve and he begins to question God. And he says, "Did God actually say that you shall not eat of any tree in the garden?" Just in that one sentence, Satan is defaming God's character. He's calling into question God's motives. And he's trying to get Adam and Eve to think that God is holding out on them. And God is a mean God. He hasn't provided for them in the way that He did. When that is not the case at all. God had provided everything that they needed in the garden. He only told them they weren't allowed to eat from one tree in the garden. Not all of them. We also see this in the book of Job. In the book of Job, the Bible tells us that there is a heavenly court that's taking place. And the sons of God come to him and present themselves before him. And in the book of Job, it says the Satan in Hebrew comes and presents himself before God. It's almost like he's a prosecutor or he's an accuser in a court of law. And in chapters 1 and chapter 2 of the book of Job, Satan, the accuser, accuses Job. And he tells God, Job only likes you because you give him things. Job only likes you because you protect him. And so God allows Satan to attack Job, and he does. But Job passes the test, and he praises God in spite of the things that he loses. And then in chapter 2, Satan goes again, and he accuses and defames Job and says, the only reason why Job loves you and likes you is because you protect him and his health. And so if you'll attack his health, he will curse you. And God allows him to attack Job's health. But there in the book of Job, we see Satan as the prosecutor, as the accuser, as the defamer. We also see that in Revelation chapter 12, verse 10. The Bible calls Satan the accuser of the brethren. The Greek word that's translated for devil in the New Testament, diabolos, means slanderer. And so that's why this is a path that we should avoid, a hazardous path that we should avoid. Because I believe that we are most like Satan when we defame and slander others. That's not the only one another command we're going to focus on today. The second path, hazardous path that we should avoid, is found in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 9. This second one another command says, don't deceive one another. It says in Colossians 3 verse 9, lie not one to another, seeing that you have put off the old man with his deeds, and have put on the new man, which is renewed in knowledge after the image of him that created him. Now, Paul tells us in Colossians chapter 3, verse 9, the reason why we should not lie one to another is because that's our old self. That's our old behavior. Those are the old ways of living. We are, in verse 10, to put on the new man and to be renewed in the knowledge after the image of him that created him. We're supposed to be more like Christ as opposed to our old way of living. Now, the Bible tells us that when we are unsaved, when we're unbelievers, we are under a certain king. We are in the kingdom of darkness. And as you know, the king of the kingdom of darkness is Satan himself. Satan loves to lie. He is the deceiver. In Genesis 3, going back to that passage, when Eve told the serpent that if they were to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that they would die. And Satan says immediately, "You shall not surely die." He lies to them. He says, God knows that when you eat, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God. So he deceived Adam and Eve. We see that all the way back from the beginning and all the way through the Bible, examples of Satan being deceptive and being a deceiver. In fact, in John chapter 8, verse 44, Jesus calls Satan a liar and the father of lies. And so the reason why we are not to lie is because that is our old master. That is the way Satan behaves. Those are the old ways of living. And Paul tells us we are to change and we're to be renewed and we're supposed to put on the new man. And we're supposed to follow after the example of Christ, who is a speaker of truth. Pattern yourselves after your new Father, your heavenly Father, and not after your former father. So not only are we supposed to avoid defaming one another or deceiving one another, thirdly, we're supposed to not devour one another. And that's the third and final one another we're going to focus on tonight. In Galatians chapter 5, verse 15, it says, "But if you bite and devour one another, take heed that ye be not consumed one of another." Apparently, this was a big issue in this church in Galatia. They were fighting amongst themselves. They were bickering. You've probably heard the phrase, it's a dog-eat-dog world. And in this church, it was a dog-eat-dog church. They were at each other's throats and attacking each other. And Paul says, be careful. Be careful if you live that way and you bite and devour one another, you're going to consume one another. It was almost like they were a pack of wolves. Now again, this reminds me of the behavior of Satan. The Bible says in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil is a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour." We are to avoid this hazardous path because it is the behavior of Satan himself to devour. So I appreciate you and thank you for listening to these 3 negative one another commands. And these are hazardous paths that we are to avoid, to defame one another, to deceive one another, and to devour one another. So I trust as you break into some time of discussion that you will think about ways that you can avoid this kind of behavior in your own lives. Thank you for listening.